Hi, I'm Dr. Willie J. Edwards, and I am teaching in this program that's called Applied Criminology. I believe this is probably your fifth class, and I am responsible for going through, helping you get through the course of criminology, criminological theories. Now, I know that most of you who, if you're undergraduate students, you majored in criminal justice or criminology, that you will know some of these. If not, if you were sociology or some of the other social behavior sciences, you will probably be aware of some of these theories. But I'm going to try to help you in the next 5 weeks to get as much and to understand as much of the theories as we possibly can. I myself enjoy the theories. I think that they're exciting because they talk about human behavior. They allow us to get an understanding, and we'll frequently have to tell people that there's no simple answer for the behavior, and especially in this case, we're talking about criminology. There is no simple answer for why a person commits a crime. But when we look at the theories, I think, and I hope that by the end of the 5th week, that you'll get an understanding too, and you feel the same way, that there is a possibility of explaining why. Now, I have a difference between understanding and tolerance. I too do not like crime. I do not tolerate criminals, but I think we have to understand them. So what we're going to do in the first chapter, and these lectures per se, or my visitation by camera to you, will be to kind of break the book up into where we're going. So what will happen is that I will talk about the first chapter now. The first chapter is the introduction to criminology. Okay, so what do we know about criminological theories, or what do we know about criminology? First of all, criminology is an interdisciplinary field. It's probably, one would say that it's a subset or subpart of sociology, so sociology being the larger field of study. And probably if you really wanted to get historically, you could go back and think in terms of the early social philosophers like Plato, Aristotle, and those people in their writing. They all wrote about man and how man acted and what was going on in his life. Now, fast forward, if you can, probably like in the 1800s, you had writers still believing somewhat that individuals were possessed by devils, and that's why they actually committed crimes or that they were mentally ill. Well, I want you to move forward a little bit, and you'll see some of this in chapter 1. But the general idea is that when we look at criminological theories, we're trying to explain human behavior, and we have to talk about in terms of the social setting in which people come, where they grow, where they live, where they function, and we also have to talk about possibly learning. What do they learn? Do they imitate things of that nature? Do they role model after individuals, and especially people who may have no concern for human life or human property? So what we start out thinking about as we read Acker's book is that we're going to look and see that criminology basically is a systematic study of why individuals commit crime. We want to have an understanding of what criminal behavior involves. Why do people violate the laws? Why do they violate the norms? What make them do that? And so as we go through chapter 1, that's what we're going to find out. We'll get a little of the history. We'll start out with some of the writers there in terms of what they were thinking. Much of the early criminology is grounded in some of the biological thinking. So you've got Garfellow, you've got Bentham, and a number of those people who are writing either in criminology or criminal justice, who tried to look at, and they wanted it really to be kind of grounded in science. So you'll see some of the early writers, like for instance, phenology was a subject area that was looked at in terms of the bumps and the lumps on a person's head. You'll be familiar with, if you've had this in your background, probably Lombroso, who also looked at some of what he talked about, the atavistic. These are people who were looked more, I said they looked more like cavemen. But anyway, so he wrote about those individuals. And so what we want to do in the very first part of the chapter is get an understanding that criminology is a theory, it's a field of study that looks at why people become criminals. Okay, so let's see if we can move forward a little bit. We have the sense of what criminology is. It is the study of, or some people would use, the writers would use, the ideology of criminal behavior. It is the focus of understanding why individuals commit crimes. So in this first chapter, you're going to see several writers, the definition of criminology, and then the background, which ties into some of the other social sciences. Again, keep in mind that I said criminology is an interdisciplinary course, because as you go through this chapter, and then especially when you get to the chapter on differential association, which will be Sutherland's theory, he will talk a little bit about how we learn to become criminals. So you want to keep all of this in mind as you begin to read through. Again, there is no simple answer. So what we start out with is a broad definition of criminology. And then one could say, well, okay, the study of individuals committing crime, the study of why individuals commit crime. It focuses on, in a systematic way, the life development, the learning, the socialization, the social environment. So again, you got to keep that in mind too, because it's a social science. So we involve the environment in which the individual comes up in. And of course, as sociologists would say, this has reference to the socialization process. So what we want to keep in mind is that a person develops into becoming a criminal. A person learns. A person will mimic, or a role model. We could talk about imitating others. So we want to keep this in mind as we move through chapter 1, getting a basis or a background of what criminology is. Now, once we have that in mind, we also want to make sure that we can make a distinction between criminology and criminal justice. Criminal justice basically deals with the three components of the criminal justice system. And we can study them systematically, scientifically, just as we do criminal behavior. It's always interesting to have students to try to understand the difference between the two, criminology and criminal justice. Now, since this is a graduate class, I'm going to assume that you know the difference and that you're aware of the three components of the criminal justice system. Well, just in case you do not, let me just say that, because I'm sure some of you are police officers, but keep in mind then there are three components. There is the law enforcement or the police. There is the court system, which naturally comes after the person is arrested, right? Some of you may be attorneys, but probably most likely not. Then after that is the correction, or what we call, then you've got the courts. From the courts, then you go to the prison. So you've got community correction, which would be probation and parole. So you've got the three components of the criminal justice system, which we can study about. There are people who are in those different agencies who work. We can study them scientifically. And so you're going to keep that in mind as you begin to digest what is criminology. Now, criminology can also talk about those components, but most likely we leave that for the criminal justice. Criminology basically will focus on why people commit crimes, what happens to make them become criminals, and that's what we're going to focus on in this chapter 1, and then from there we'll go into the several other chapters that will actually talk about specific theories. Okay, now you know this is going to be very interesting. As we've talked about criminology, we've talked about the criminal justice, the idea of what it focuses on. Let me just say quickly something about the criminal or crime data. Now, again, most of you who are working in the agencies, you know that there are basically 4 methods. There are 4 areas in which we can get data on people committing crimes. And of course, most of us are familiar with the Uniform Crime Report, which we know is put out by the FBI every year. And it actually looks at about 8 different crimes that are called Index 1, Type 1 crimes. And I won't go through all of that because it's not really necessary for you in this course. Some of you may remember that. But that's the Uniform Crime Report. Some of you may be familiar with the victimization study data, which you know is also done by the Bureau of Justice Statistics, and it actually looks, as it says, at the victims. It counts victims. There is a certain number of victims, and let's put it this way, a certain number of the population that is interviewed every year, and they are asked if they've been victimized, and they fill out a form that is used to give us some idea of the victimization, the number of people who are victims. Third, we could use what is called self-reported studies, and most sociologists and criminology people like to use that because it actually asks people what have they done. What kind of crimes have they been involved in? So that's exactly what it is a self-reported study. Now the last one is the most recent one, which is the National Incident-Based System Reporting, which again is done by the FBI. It's a little bit more detailed than the Uniform Crime Report, and it will look at a larger variation of criminal activity. So keep those in mind because we always want to have some idea of the volume of crime. That helps us, and it also helps us in determining where we can find crime being located. And we'll talk about that when we get to our chapter on social disorganization and strain theory. But that's a pretty good start for right now.